Hi, thank you for joining me for part 2 of the discussion on death and the afterlife. If you haven't watched part 1, I recommend that you do so before diving into part 2 because it serves as the foundation for the following discussion. In part 1, I talked about past life regression couched in quantum mechanics and explained how it gives us a glimpse into what happens when we die. Here, I would like to focus on astral projection as another window into the afterlife. Many individuals, myself included, have had lucid out-of-body experiences, which prove that you can leave your body, travel to other worlds and dimensions, and return, resuming your normal life without interruption. Astral projection shows that consciousness is neither bound to the physical body, nor is it a product thereof. Learning to leave the body at will can prove invaluable when it comes to exploring the various micro-realities and their subsystems, thus serving as a kind of research lab for the study of consciousness. It also helps us to prepare for the process of death by assuaging our fears and allowing us to get used to operating outside of the body and the physically based paradigm. When we leave our body, we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that we don't die. Yes, the body, which is limited and finite, wears out and breaks down over time, just like a car with a lot of mileage on it, but the consciousness that uses physical form as a vehicle of manifestation is indestructible and immortal. What is death? For convenience sake, I'm going to explain this from the linear point of view of our microsystem, which is how it's perceived by the human mind, even though in a larger scheme of things, that's not exactly what happens, mechanically speaking. Now, this doesn't mean that the linear experience itself isn't valid or real. You would agree that all the events you experience in this life feel quite real and for all intents and purposes are real when viewed within the framework of this reality. For instance, you may suffer through a great deal of hardships and loss and be affected by them deeply and profoundly. But once you're finished with the incarnation and view the experience from the more expanded soul perspective, you might perceive it as play pretend and not at all as serious an affair as you thought it was when you were in the midst of it as a limited human. I think it's important to understand this difference. It's kind of like when you're having a bad dream which feels very vivid and real while you're in it, until you wake up and are relieved to find out that it was only a dream. When our incarnation is complete and the consciousness that conceived us withdraws its energy, that energy is simply refocused elsewhere. What does this mean? First, I'd like to talk about the actual mechanism of disembodiment, which will require a brief introduction to spiritual anatomy. As you may know, the consciousness that we are makes use of various bodies, which together make up a singular organism. Each body is a specialized vehicle designed to interact with a specific level of vibrational reality. We're all quite familiar with the physical body, which is used to interface with the physical dimension. We also have an astral body that is known as the emotional body. It's the vehicle used by our consciousness to manifest in non-physical dimension. This is the body we use in astral projection as well as after the death of our physical form. The emotional body is very malleable and can take on any shape we desire. Most often, however, we will give it the form that corresponds with our current physical likeness, which is why during out-of-body experiences we find that we look the same way as we do in our waking state. Each time we incarnate into this microsystem of reality, in addition to manifesting a physical body that makes it possible for us to navigate in the physical dimension, we also manifest a corresponding energy body, which is specifically tailored to our current physical form. This energy structure, which I will interchangeably refer to as energosoma or hollow chakra, is the membrane that holds the physical and the astral bodies together, enabling the flow of energy and information between them. While energosoma literally translates as energy body, Hollow chakra simply means the body which is defined as the totality of our chakras. So they're one and the same. Hollow chakra permeates the physical body inside and out through a complex network of meridians and vortices. When we do energy healing, that is the structure that's being affected. Additionally, the physical and the astral bodies are connected by what is known as the silver cord. If you were to observe it in an out-of-body state, you might see this cord as a line of energy, most commonly coming out of the solar plexus chakra or the nuchal chakra at the nape of your neck, which sits slightly above the posterior throat chakra. The location of the silver cord, however, can vary from person to person, and in my personal view, depends on the level of consciousness of each individual. The spot where the silver cord forms a connection with the physical body is the soul's entry point into the physical dimension. It's where the subtle energy of the soul crystallizes into solid form. Those with more elevated levels of awareness come into the body through the top chakras, while those of us who are less expanded or more dense create the silver cord connection through one of the lower chakras. In our waking state, the astral and the physical bodies are closely aligned and are held together by the hollow chakra. When we are asleep, however, these bodies separate. We refer to these disconnections as out-of-body experiences. The degree of separation depends on the condition of our energosoma. Our astral body can float above or quite close to the physical body, but it can also travel to other worlds and dimensions. The less blocked we are in our chakras, the further we can venture away from the body without feeling the pull of the silver cord. And as long as the silver cord remains intact, we will always come back into the body, no matter how far we travel astrally. It's this cord that keeps the body alive. Upon death, however, the silver cord is permanently severed, moving us out of the physical realm of existence. Once the astral and the physical bodies disconnect, the next step is shedding of the energosoma, which carries all the data pertaining to the life that just ended. As I said earlier, with each incarnation, we get a new energosoma. However, sometimes the grieving loved ones miss the dead so much that they keep pulling on the deceased by directing too much mental energy toward them, which makes it much harder for the dead individual to let go of the incarnation they had just completed. This means that the old hollow chakra may remain attached to the emotional body and will be carried over into the next life, like old baggage, in addition to the new energosoma. It's kind of like wearing an extra winter coat on top of another one. This makes the overall condition of the person's energetic anatomy more dense and rigid, which isn't a good thing at all, but that's a discussion for another time. What happens once the disembodiment is complete and the primary point of focus shifts from physical perspective to the non-physical is that we all come face to face with our predominant vibration, that is, thoughts, beliefs, sentiments, and emotions. There are self-proclaimed gurus out there like Teal Swan and Bettino Masaru who claim that death is delicious and easy and wonderful. And it certainly could be for some, but it could also be confusing and unpleasant for others. What a person encounters in the afterlife is determined by the individual themselves. You know the saying, wherever you go, there you are? It simply means that we cannot avoid the consequences or the effects of our own energy. In other words, what we put out is what we get back. Let me give you a personal example of how this works energetically. About 10 months ago, I embarked on a healing journey of regenerative detoxification by switching to a high-fruit, raw vegan diet. Needless to say, this was a difficult adjustment for me. And while I wasn't eating the foods that I used to, I still had the cravings for them. I was hungry, and of course I missed the taste. So what happened was that I would have vivid dreams and out-of-body experiences where I would gorge on the food that I was denying myself in my waking state. Why? Because the vibration of hunger and my desire was dominating my frequency. Those of you who have had lucid out-of-body experiences know that when you are operating outside of the physical system, as you do when you shed your body through death, every thought and feeling is instantly manifested externally and is perceived as a tangible form. The reason this is so is that there's no delay in a non-physical medium. Here in the physical density, we may feel angry, scared, or sad, and be able to mask and conceal our internal state from others by acting out of sync with our true feelings. But it's impossible to hide who we are in a disembodied state because energy does not lie. So while the body may serve as a sort of armor, providing a buffer between us and our physical environment, in the non-physical dimension, there's no such boundary separating us from our surroundings. The other reason we can't suppress our true nature is that, as we've already established, on the non-physical plane, we manifest through our emotional body. So in a sense, we're wearing our emotions on our sleeve because all our thoughts and feelings are externalized. That is why upon death, we are unavoidably confronted with the true reflection and the impact of our personal vibration. Once the physical form is discarded, we are automatically magnetically pulled into the dimensional reality that matches our dominant energetic frequency. This isn't a new concept, and the same rule applies to our physical experience, which also mirrors our inner state. If you're familiar with the law of attraction, then you know that when we operate on a lower frequency, we find things to be challenging, encountering obstacles and difficulties. But in the physical dimension, we often fail to correlate the negative external manifestation with our internal condition, because the vibration in this reality is so dense and slow that it takes time to materialize into an object or event, creating a lagging effect. In other words, there is too much of a gap between the mental inception and physical manifestation. However, there is no such gap or lag when you're operating on the non-physical plane. And the law of attraction always applies, regardless of whether or not you have a body or what dimension of reality you occupy. I'd like to make a side note here. Because our frequency instantly manifests as external projection in non-physical reality, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of what someone might perceive as their after-death environment could be their own thought forms that they've projected and not necessarily the true nature of the dimensional landscape they find themselves in. This has to be taken into account when people describe their near-death experiences. Just because they perceived something in a certain way, it doesn't mean that it was in fact authentic or objectively real, if you will. Sometimes when a person dies, and more so when this happens very suddenly and unexpectedly, they may not be aware that they have passed. If you think back to the planes crashing into Twin Towers on 9/11, it was a sort of a freak event, the possibility of which no one ever even imagined. One minute, people were at their desks working, and the next minute they were dead. Or a person could be in a car accident, and what happens once they leave the body is that they find that they can still perceive themselves. Even though they're no longer physical, their astral body feels quite real and solid to them. And because they still have awareness and feel no pain or see no injuries, they might think that they actually survived the accident and are still alive. You can see how this might cause confusion for the deceased. So they simply keep going as if nothing has changed. Since they are no longer in the physical dimension and can no longer interact with it in the same way, what they do is they create thought forms of the environment and the people they were familiar with during their physical life. In a sense, they become stuck in their own hallucinations, believing them to be real. So, dimensionally speaking, they're in a sort of limbo, neither here nor there. This psychosis, for the lack of a better word, prevents them from moving forward to the next stage and often requires intervention. Without outside help, a person could be stuck in their self-induced delusion for centuries. Unfortunately, spirit guides cannot help these individuals because of the significant vibrational gap. The guide's frequency is so high compared to that of the deceased individual that the guide could be standing right next to them, and they won't be able to perceive it. And this is where you and I come in. Guides will use living people in an astrally projected state as intermediaries because our frequency is much closer in vibration to the disembodied individual. So many of us do rescue work when we are asleep and out of our bodies. The key to this kind of work is doing something that would catch the attention of the disoriented being and alert the displaced spirit to the fact that they are no longer physical. My guides once brought me to a man named Frank who had constructed a fully staffed office out of his own energy and was going about his business as if he were at work. He was having conversations with people who were nothing more than his own thought forms. So somehow I got the idea to jump on his desk and then made it disappear by exteriorizing energy toward it. I then started to do the same to his co-workers. I said to him, Frank, look, Frank, this place isn't real. These people aren't real. You've been talking to yourself. Now, since in the physical world, you can't just make people or objects disappear at will, he realized that something was off and was then willing to listen and be guided to where he was supposed to go. Usually, once the individual gains lucidity, it's easier for the guides to steer them in the right direction. So when people talk about their afterlife experiences, there are two possibilities we must always consider. Number one, their perception may have been their own mental creation. And number two, the interpretation of what they encountered could be less than accurate due to their limited perspective or understanding. Let me explain it this way. If you look up at the moon in its waxing or waning phase, you'll see a sickle-shaped flat sliver glowing with cool light, seemingly illuminating the night sky. A few hundred years ago, this would have been accepted as empirically true. It's reasonable to assume that if what you see is a glowing sickle, then that's what it must be. Of course, today we know that the moon isn't a sickle and it doesn't glow. Instead, it's a sphere made up of rock. Now, does this mean that our lying eyes are deceiving us? No, we are simply perceiving a limited perspective or a fraction of reality that represents the concept which we know as the moon. That's why it's important to remember that perception doesn't necessarily equal reality. And we should keep this in mind when experiencing any phenomenon that is outside of our normal purview. I spoke about this in detail in part 1 in terms of macro versus micro reality. In this particular example, the moon changes its appearance depending on the phase it's in and whether it's being observed from Earth, another planet, or its own surface. So, point of reference serves as the filter which determines how we perceive and therefore interpret any one of our experiences. Now that I got that out of the way, I'd like to revisit suicide and its aftermath, which I briefly touched upon in part 1. I think that this would help to create some context as to what an individual might experience immediately after discarding the body. When people choose to commit suicide and find themselves in a heavy, negative dimensional place, it's not because they're being punished for breaking some cardinal rules. You see, those who end their lives are usually depressed, hopeless, and despondent, which is why after death they find themselves on astral planes that are reflective of this inner turmoil. But there are also instances when a person ends their life with clarity, while in a stable emotional state, as a conscious choice to say end the suffering from a terminal illness, while knowing that the soul is immortal and indestructible. Either way you look at it, in the context of eternity, one such decision isn't that big of a deal, because to the soul, every experience is a valuable opportunity to learn more about itself. You see, the body is only a temporary vehicle for the soul, albeit a necessary one. The soul cannot operate in the physical dimension without it, just like a pilot can't fly in the air without a plane. If this vehicle has been damaged beyond repair, the pilot may decide to preemptively eject from the compromised plane before it goes down in flames, rather than be a sitting duck. Obviously, this would be a markedly different scenario from crashing the jet simply because you're afraid to fly in a thunderstorm and hate turbulence. So when an individual isn't operating out of fear or other low emotions when choosing to pull the plug, their afterlife experience isn't marked by the same trauma and discord as when the act is committed out of mental instability. But even when it's done as an ill-conceived attempt to avoid facing serious issues, the soul doesn't see it as an irreparable transgression that warrants eternal damnation, as religion would have you believe. It's sort of like when you get drunk and foolishly decide to drive. You may wrap your car around a tree, end up in the hospital, and get a DUI. Obviously not your finest moment, but it doesn't define your entire life, nor does it erase all the good you've done. You simply recognize that you made a stupid mistake, you learn from it, and make better choices as a result of that difficult lesson. Of course, there is regret on the soul's part for wasting a great opportunity, but no one judges you other than yourself. As you may remember from the post-death experience I shared in part 1, while my guide was pleased to tell me that I had completed 95% of my program, the weight of that unfinished 5% felt like a massive failure to me, and I felt terribly about it. Besides, there are always consequences to dropping out of the incarnation prematurely. How so? Considering that we don't actually die and only change form, it's impossible to avoid dealing with our issues by simply deactivating the body. Eventually, we'll have to face those very same issues in a different body. Just like when you flunk out of a class, you have to repeat it the following semester, but now in addition to the more advanced new curriculum. So while killing yourself might seem like the easy way out to the ego identity, in actuality it complicates things for the soul and only creates more work in the long run. I think at this point we've established that what we encounter immediately after death is in large part determined by our level of consciousness and beliefs. For instance, people with strong religious convictions may initially encounter procedures that would be in line with their spiritual teachings. Their guides may also take on the guise of familiar saints or prophets, all of which is done to make them more comfortable and relaxed. But once the individual acclimates to their new circumstance as a disembodied entity and regains awareness of who they are as a soul, those theatrics are no longer necessary and are dispensed with. On the other hand, if someone is a negatively oriented person who's harmed and even perhaps killed people, they're going to find themselves in a dreadful, gnarly place full of other beings much like themselves. And this is done through the law of vibrational attraction. It's kind of like being in the worst prison you could imagine, except there are no guards, no rules, and no order. Now, this doesn't mean that they are forever relegated to suffering in those lower dimensions. Every individual is in control of their fate, both in life and death. They have free will and therefore the freedom to choose their vibration. If they change and shift toward a more loving, positive state of being, they will automatically move onto a different astral plane that is reflective of the adjustment in their frequency. There's a great movie starring late Robin Williams called What Dreams May Come. It depicts quite accurately what happens in some suicides. It also shows some hellish-like non-physical environments filled with anguish and suffering. It's a great film. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. There's another well-made movie based on the book No Solar by Chico Javier that deals with afterlife, and it's called Astral City. This movie is available for free on YouTube with English subtitles. The closest experience I had to going through death into the afterlife was through my alternate self. As you may know, in the quantum field, there are numerous versions of ourselves exploring parallel lines of existence. Some are pretty close to our current life, while others can diverge quite a bit. Due to the probable nature of future events, there are a number of built-in variations, all of which have the potential for actualization. Because we only recognize as real that which we can perceive with our senses, any probable event must become a physical manifestation to be acknowledged as such. Each of us chooses only one of the potential probabilities to be materialized as an actual event. However, this does not mean that all other gestational probabilities are denied expression or somehow cease to exist. Every time we make a choice, the option we reject doesn't just disappear into non-existence, but is lived out by the probable self who did choose it. You see, every probability we discard finds expression in an alternate system of existence where it becomes the officially accepted version of reality. This results in a kind of splitting off that occurs at every junction and fork in the road where we make a choice, either consciously or unconsciously. What does this mean in real terms? Let's say that you have a decision to make when it comes to a choice of colleges. For simplicity's sake, we'll narrow it down to two options. Of course, under normal circumstances, we have no idea of how our decision will play out at the time of choosing. But since this is a hypothetical situation, we're going to take some liberties with future projections. Let's say that if you choose school A, you're going to meet someone you fall in love with, marry, and start a family. After finishing your studies, you become a veterinary assistant and live a simple, quiet life. But if you choose school B, you end up crossing paths with a guest lecturer who is one of the leading researchers in a big biotech company. This professor recognizes your potential and takes you under her wing. As a result, you become involved in groundbreaking research, pioneering new discoveries in the pharmaceutical field. However, because of being so intensely focused on work, your personal life is pretty much non-existent. You're single and live alone. But on the upside, the work you do has tremendous impact globally and is changing countless lives for the better. As you can see, a seemingly simple choice can have profound implications for our probable future. When you choose one option, the other one is automatically adopted by a different probable version of you. No opportunity for experience is ever wasted by the soul. This means that there is a number of slightly or significantly varied versions of ourselves constantly branching off, inhabiting quite real worlds that happen to run along different tracks parallel to the one we occupy. Each such probable dimension exists autonomously and is perfectly real in the most tangible sense to the version of the self that perceives it. And if you watched part 1, then you know that each of these probabilities simply represents a subsystem within our physical micro-reality. A prolific out-of-body traveler who invented the famous hemisync technology and founded the Monroe Institute, Robert Monroe, wrote extensively about his first-hand experience with his alternate self, whom he referred to as me there. I strongly recommend his books on astral projection to those of you who are interested in learning more about this fascinating phenomenon. I myself have visited many of my own alternate selves, which allowed me the opportunity to view their lives through a different set of eyes. The one I'm going to share with you here is special in that I walked in on this particular version of myself shortly before she died, and then lived through a portion of the period of adjustment she experienced directly after her death. Now, you might dismiss it as just a dream or a product of my imagination, but that dream felt incredibly real and had a profound impact on my consciousness. As one of my favorite channeled entities, Bashar, said, "You cannot imagine non-existence." This was a short life, which I would have had if my father married a different woman than the one I currently know as my biological mother. In this alternate version, I was still the oldest child, but I had 4 other siblings instead of just the one younger brother I presently have. I was also seriously overweight and a smoker, which is diametrically opposed to my current reality. This alternate me was 19, while the self who was having the dream was 26 at the time. Even though she was at the forefront of the experience, where I was looking through her eyes, some vestiges of my so-called real persona still remained, albeit way in the background. But this enabled me to make comparisons and see how we were different. I vividly remember the house I shared with my alternate family, the framed photos on the wall, and the SUV my other mother drove, shuttling all the kids around. This woman was warm, loving, and very involved in her children's activities, unlike my mother in this reality, who's a stone-cold narcissist that battered me like a piñata till I ran off at the age of 16. Not surprisingly, such contrasting childhood experiences would account for significant differences in our personalities. My alternate self was carefree, a bit of a prankster, and a silly girl, whereas this me is more serious and reserved. As the dream progressed, I was getting pulled in deeper into the experience. In a sense, I became this other girl, and I lived her mundane day-to-day life as a teenager till her death at 19. What's even more interesting was that I also got to experience what she did directly after her death. This particular self didn't immediately move on into the afterlife, but her ghost hung around her family. In some instances, this happens because the person doesn't realize that they have passed. In this case, however, she knew that she was dead, but felt attached to her family and didn't want to leave them just yet. She enjoyed the fact that she could still be with them and watch them while being completely invisible to them. To her, it was like having a superpower. The only person who could still perceive her was the youngest sister, who was 5 at the time. This other me got a kick out of torturing her mother by having the kid's sister repeat profound things that a child of her age couldn't think of, and especially passing on messages from me and telling mom that I was right there talking to her. For maximum effect, my alternate self especially enjoyed doing this when the mother was driving, because it often unnerved her to the point that she would swerve on the road. Another thing the other me enjoyed was following people into the bathroom and eavesdropping on private conversations, which gave her an immense sense of satisfaction. Then one day, the family were having a party with a lot of people gathering at the house. True to her form, the dead girl was up to no good, waving her hands in people's faces, pushing them, and so on, until one man looked directly at her and she realized that he could see her. This stunned her and she panicked because she'd been discovered. Getting caught really scared her, and since I was experiencing her emotions as my own, I also felt shaken, which jolted me out of my sleep. Well, there was another surprise, because as I woke up and sat up in my bed, I became even more frightened because I didn't recognize the room I was in. Panic and confusion came over me while I was trying to figure out where I was. My surroundings looked strange and unfamiliar, and I was pretty scared. You see, I was so immersed into that other life that even though the experience lasted only a brief period of time, that life was now at the forefront of my consciousness as the primary point of focus. So when I woke up as her in my room, which was a place she'd never seen. For what seemed like the longest couple of minutes or so, I had no recollection of me as the 26-year-old Ivana who went to sleep in her bed. Of course, I experienced a small panic attack while I frantically tried to orient myself. Then little by little, the dream started to fade away and I began to regain my sense of identity and understanding of what just happened. What I found interesting is that there was a moment where I merged with the probable self to such an extent that I had no awareness of the version of me who was having the dream. For all intents and purposes, this Ivana didn't exist. There was only the 19-year-old dead girl haunting her family. I imagine that in some individuals, this could cause a psychotic break. I've had many other such experiences since then where this kind of enmeshment caused my present persona to get pushed out or displaced. And every time there would be a period of confusion followed by adjustment and gradual reintegration. As the frequency of these experiences increased, the periods of displacement and readjustment became shorter and less disorienting, as happens with any learning curve. The more you do something, the easier it becomes. Being able to jump through parallel lives got me thinking about the relative nature of reality and made me question which version of me was real and which was just a dream. The more I pondered this, the more I realized that in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really matter because to each version, they are the primary reality. It's all a matter of perspective. If you consider the whole self, which contains the two versions I experienced along with countless others, then it regards all parts of itself as equally valid and important. The other realization I came to was that no matter how realistic or engrossing my alternate life may have been for a short period of time, my primary reality self didn't disappear or cease to exist while I briefly shifted out of it. Throughout the entire experience, my body remained safe in my bedroom, and it was only a portion of my consciousness that temporarily traveled to a different dimension, but ultimately returned to its home base. In other words, I didn't go missing in this reality while my consciousness explored a different line of existence. I believe that this is what it's like when we incarnate into various realities. There is a greater, much more expanded version of us that simultaneously explores multiple lives by projecting portions of its awareness into various dimensions. And once it's finished with those experiences, it simply wakes up, returning to its natural, consciously integrated state. To that greater self, all these countless existences are just vivid dreams. We imagine that when we die here, we travel into the so-called afterlife, which is a mysterious and unknown place. But in reality, the soul that we are never actually leaves that place, just as we never leave our bedroom when we embark on our dream journeys. So in a sense, our various incarnations are only dream personas of the primary soul identity. And to that identity, what we perceive as the finality of death is just a routine process of waking up, returning to its regular activities, and then continuing to dream other personalities and places into existence. So when a person dies and then goes through a certain process on the other side, which may also include being taken to a healing place to convalesce after a difficult incarnation, it's to help them get their bearings. All these steps are put into place to help the being reintegrate into their real self who had just had a very deep, vivid, and immersive dream, causing them to become temporarily disoriented, just as I was when I woke up after experiencing a portion of the life lived by an alternate me. But you see, there are different kinds of dreams. While we have dreams that take us over so completely that we have a hard time getting back to reality, we also have lucid dreams, where we are aware that we are dreaming and have the ability to direct and alter the course of the dream in line with our goals and expectations. Being awake in the dream makes it easy to come out of it with minimal adjustment due to our level of awareness and control. And it's like that with our incarnations. In some, we lose touch with our home-based reality, as we do in the physical plane. Coming out of those kinds of lives requires a more involved process. But we also have incarnations on higher planes, where we aren't as dense or perhaps aren't even physical at all. In those lives, we are aware of ourselves as the dreamer who is creating and directing the dream. In such incarnations, the line between the dream and reality, and I'm referring to the macro reality here, is so fine and so faint that crossing it is as easy as walking from one room into another, and doesn't require the extensive and complicated process we go through when transitioning from our physical lives on Earth. The fact that so many people are starting to question the nature of reality is an indication that we are becoming aware that this life is a dream. This recognition is the first step. The next step is waking up within the dream and then consciously gaining control of it. And that's why we refer to the expansion of consciousness as awakening. I hope you found this information interesting, helpful, and easy to follow. Thanks for watching, liking, and sharing.